A woman lived alone for years, until a giant young rancher and his old father asked, "Can we stay one night?" The cicadas throbbed in the heat of late summer, their hum thick in the air around the solitary cabin crouched against the fringe of the prairie. Clara Whitfield paused on her porch step, a tin pail in hand, and narrowed her eyes at the wavering horizon. It wasn't the weather that unsettled her. The sky lay wide and clean, blue fading toward the pale dust of evening. No storm clouds pressed. Yet something rumbled, distant, low, like a wagon wheel catching rock or a horse striking earth in panic. Her breath tightened. For years she had lived alone, counting the sound of her own footsteps against silence. The land gave her noise enough, the howl of coyotes, the restless shifting of wind through dry grass, the hiss of crickets at night, but this sound was different. Urgent. Heavy. She set the pail aside and gripped the rifle propped near the doorframe. The metal was warm against her palm, sun-soaked, familiar. She stepped out from under the porch roof, shading her eyes. The rumble grew clearer. A wagon, laboring. A team of horses foamed at their mouths, straining. Dust plumed high, trailing like smoke. Then she saw them, two men atop the seat. The younger, large-shouldered, dark hair clinging damp with sweat. His hands were firm on the reins, fighting to keep the team from breaking apart. Beside him sat an older man, stooped and coughing even as the wagon jolted. Behind them, 3 riders gave chase, their pistols flashing in the late light. Clara's heart pitched hard against her ribs. Her instinct was to retreat, to bar the door and vanish into silence as she had done with every stranger that wandered too close. But those men bore the look of hunted creatures, and the riders behind them carried menace like a second skin. She raised the rifle, steadied her breath, and let the years of practiced solitude guide her hand. The crack split the air, rolling across the prairie. One rider flinched, his horse bucking sideways. Another cursed, pulling back. Clara didn't aim to kill, only to warn. Her shot bought the wagon a heartbeat's worth of distance. The younger man glanced toward the cabin, his eyes catching hers for a flicker of a second. Even at that distance, she felt the weight of them, steady, searching, urgent. Then the wagon careened as a wheel struck a rut, nearly throwing them both. The old man clutched his chest, doubled over with coughs. Clara fired again, closer this time. Splinters leapt from the dirt at a rider's feet. The bandits wheeled their mounts, uncertain now, unwilling to take a bullet for a chase at dusk. They pulled back, spitting curses that carried across the dry grass. After a tense moment, they turned their horses and melted into the far slope, dust rising like ghosts in their wake. The wagon rattled on, slowing only when it reached the slope below Clara's cabin. The young man fought the horses down, reining them hard until the team shuddered to a halt. Silence returned, except for the gasping of beasts and the ragged cough of the old man. Clara lowered her rifle but did not set it aside. She stepped forward as the younger man leapt from the wagon, his boots striking dirt. Up close he was taller than she expected, broad through the chest and shoulders, sweat darkening his shirt. He moved with the taut precision of someone who had fought before, but his eyes were calm, even when rimmed with exhaustion. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, respectful, his accent touched by the plains. "My father's hurt. The wheel's near gone. We've nowhere else to put in." The old man coughed again, trying to wave off the concern, but his hand trembled. Clara's throat tightened. The smell of dust and sweat clung to them, harsh but honest. She had not invited another soul past her threshold in years. To do so now felt like laying bare the only thing she had left. Still, she nodded once, curt. "Bring him inside." The younger man's shoulders eased just slightly with relief. He helped his father down, cradling the frail frame against his strength, and together they climbed toward the porch. Clara stepped aside, holding the door with her free hand, the rifle still cradled in the other. She felt the old boards under her feet creak in protest, as though the cabin itself had grown used to solitude. Inside, the room smelled of cedar smoke and herbs. The old man settled heavily onto a chair, wheezing, his skin pale beneath the leather lines of age. Clara fetched water from the shelf and set it before him without a word. His shaking hands wrapped the tin cup like it was salvation. The younger man stood in the doorway, gaze sweeping the cabin with quiet measure. His presence filled the small space, not only in stature but in the sense of vigilance he carried. Clara could feel him searching, judging if the cabin was truly safe, if she was truly friend. "You've our thanks," he said at last. His voice was calm, but underneath it lay the raw edge of weariness. Clara only inclined her head. She had long since forgotten the ease of conversation. Her silence did not unsettle him. He seemed the sort who understood things better in quiet. The old man cleared his throat, his words rough as gravel. "Name's Jedediah Harwood. This here's my boy, Elias." Clara's hands stiffened around the rifle stock. Names made strangers human, and humans carried the risk of grief. Still, she forced the word past her lips, her voice low and dry from disuse. "Clara Whitfield." Jedediah managed a faint smile. "A fine name. A strong name." She said nothing. Instead she crossed to the hearth, kindled a flame, and set a pot of water to boil. The men had arrived on the tale of violence, and though the riders had fled, Clara felt the danger coiling still in the distance. Her home had been a fortress against loneliness, but now it had become a target's mark. Elias crouched by the window, scanning the prairie with sharp eyes. His rifle leaned within reach, yet he did not fidget. His stillness was almost uncanny, like a predator patient in the grass. She studied him out of the corner of her eye. The unshaven jaw, the streak of dirt across his temple, the way his chest rose slow and steady despite the fight that had nearly undone him. "You live out here alone," he said finally, not as question but as fact. Clara's hands froze over the pot. She swallowed, then nodded once. "For years." He turned his gaze back outside. "Brave. Or cursed." The words struck deeper than she expected. She focused on the fire, on the hiss of water beginning to simmer. Jedediah coughed into a rag, streaks of red blooming against the cloth. Clara caught the sight, her chest tightening. She fetched a jar of dried willow bark from her shelf, ground it with a mortar, and poured it into the boiling water. When she set the cup in his hands, his eyes softened with gratitude beyond words. For a moment, the cabin felt different, alive again, as if the presence of others had shaken off the long weight of silence. Clara retreated to the corner, gripping her rifle, yet the walls no longer felt like they belonged to her alone. Outside, the prairie quieted. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and violet. Cicadas gave way to the first cries of night birds. Elias closed the shutters, then sat against the wall, rifle across his knees, shoulders bowed not from weakness but from vigilance. Clara watched him, torn between resentment and relief. She had built her life on solitude, on keeping the world's cruelties at a distance. Yet tonight, the world had forced its way in, through dust, through fire of gunpowder, through the haunted eyes of a young man and the failing breaths of his father. She knew already, the riders would return. Men like that did not vanish into the dusk. They regrouped, they hungered, they sought to finish what had been interrupted. The cabin that had stood untouched for years was no longer invisible. Clara's grip on the rifle tightened until her knuckles blanched. She stared at the flame in the hearth, its light dancing across the rough-hewn walls. In the flicker she saw her own reflection, alone, brittle, weary. And beside it, the shadows of two men who had brought danger and something else with them. Something she had not expected to feel again. The night deepened, carrying with it the sharp tang of fear and the faint, unfamiliar warmth of company. Outside, in the distance, a horse whinnied. The sound was faint but deliberate, not the wild call of a stray but the warning of riders who had not given up their hunt. Clara lifted her eyes to Elias, who already sat upright, hand firm on his rifle. His gaze met hers across the dim room, steady and unyielding. In that silent exchange, she knew, this was only the beginning. The cabin breathed with a new kind of silence that night, not the long hollow quiet Clara Whitfield had grown used to, but one filled with the weight of unfamiliar presence. The fire on the hearth snapped and hissed, casting amber light across the room where Jedediah Harwood lay stretched on her cot, his chest rattling faintly with each labored breath. His son, Elias, sat not far from him, back against the wall, his rifle laid lengthwise across his knees. Clara moved about her space with slow precision, every gesture careful, as though any sound she made might draw too much attention to the fact that she was no longer alone. She placed bowls of stew on the table, thick with beans and the last carrots from her garden, thin with water she had rationed against late summer's stingy rains. She had not cooked for others in years. Her hands trembled slightly when she ladled the broth, and she pressed her lips tight, annoyed at the weakness. Elias rose, his shadow filling the small room, and helped his father to sit upright. Jedediah murmured thanks, voice hoarse, but his eyes warmed as Clara set the bowl into his hands. Elias, with a nod of gratitude, accepted his own. He did not eat immediately. Instead, he watched Clara, his expression unreadable, before turning to the meal with a hunger restrained only by courtesy. They ate in near silence. The scrape of spoons against wood, the rustle of the flames, the faint whistle of wind through the chinks in the walls, these were the only sounds. Clara sat opposite Elias, her rifle propped within reach on the table's edge. Each time his gaze drifted to it, she felt her cheeks heat, but she did not move it. Trust was not a thing given easily, not in a land that had taken everything once before. Jedediah broke the silence with a cough. "You've kept this place strong, Miss Whitfield. Alone all these years? That takes grit." Clara lowered her eyes. Compliments felt dangerous. They made her chest ache in places she preferred left untouched. Grit or foolishness? Can't say which. The old man chuckled softly, though it caught in his throat and turned to another cough. Elias's hand steadied his back until the spasm passed. Clara caught the gesture, the careful patience in it, and something within her shifted, recognizing a devotion as deep as her own stubbornness to survive. After supper, she gathered the bowls and scrubbed them in a basin. Elias offered to help, but she shook her head, unwilling to share the intimate rhythm of her chores. Still, she found herself glancing at him as he knelt to mend the frayed leather strap of his father's satchel. His fingers were thick with callus, yet his movements bore a quiet precision, like someone who valued order in the midst of hardship. When the dishes were set away, Clara lit a lantern and placed it near Jedediah. The old man's eyelids drooped, his body sagging with exhaustion. Elias eased him back onto the cot, tucking the quilt around his thin shoulders. Clara noticed the quilt had been her mother's, worn soft from decades of washing. The sight of another beneath it tightened her throat, but she said nothing. Outside, the night pressed close, thick with the sounds of prairie insects and the distant cry of a coyote. Elias stood at the window, peering into the dark, the tension in his frame coiled and unrelenting. Clara lingered near the hearth, pretending to tidy. "You expect them back," she said at last, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. His head turned, shadows cutting sharp across his face. "Men like that don't let go easy." Her grip tightened around the wooden spoon in her hand. "Then you brought trouble here." The words were sharper than she intended, and she regretted them when she saw his jaw tighten, his shoulders rise. But he did not answer with anger. Instead, he nodded, slow and deliberate. "I did. And I'll see it doesn't break your door." Clara's heart stumbled. Such certainty in his tone, steady as an oath, unnerved her. She had learned to expect little from others, yet this man, still half stranger, spoke as though her safety mattered as much as his father's. She turned back to the hearth, the firelight warming her face, hiding the turmoil in her eyes. As the hours passed, the cabin settled. Jedediah slept fitfully, murmuring through dreams. Elias remained near the window, a sentinel etched in firelight and shadow. Clara withdrew to her small room, but the walls felt thin, the air heavy with unfamiliar presence. She sat on the edge of her bed, fingers twisting the hem of her nightdress, listening to the low murmur of Elias shifting his weight, the faint rasp of his father's breathing. For the first time in years, she was not alone, and she did not know whether to fear or welcome it. Morning broke with a haze of gold spilling over the horizon. Clara rose early, as was her habit, and stepped outside into the cool breath of dawn. The grass glittered with dew, the air damp and sweet, carrying the faint smoke of her own chimney. She drew water from the well, the rope rough against her palms, and carried the bucket back inside. Elias was already awake, seated by the cold ashes of the fire. He had not slept, or if he had, it was only in moments. His eyes bore the red rim of weariness, yet they were alert. He rose when she entered, taking the bucket from her hand with ease, as though it were natural to share burdens. The gesture startled her. For years every task had been hers alone. She nearly told him she didn't need his help, but the words died before leaving her lips. Breakfast was plain, cornbread left from the night before, coffee boiled bitter in a blackened pot. They ate quietly again, but something had shifted in the silence. It was no longer brittle. There was a weight of unspoken understanding in it, like the first fragile threads of trust spun between them. After the meal, Elias stepped outside to tend the wagon. Clara followed at a distance, arms folded, watching him crouch to inspect the broken wheel. He stripped his shirt in the rising heat, muscles moving like corded rope beneath his skin. The scar along his shoulder caught the light, pale against the tan, a mark of violence survived. Clara turned her gaze quickly, heat flushing her face, ashamed of her curiosity. He worked without complaint, shaping wood with his knife, binding with leather. The rhythm of his labor carried a quiet assurance, as if each strike of the blade, each knot tied, declared his determination to hold things together. Clara found herself drawn closer, until she stood near enough to see the sweat streak his brow. Without speaking, she fetched a jug of water and held it out. He looked at her then, a long look that weighed more than thanks, and drank deeply. His throat moved with each swallow, and when he lowered the jug, he murmured, "You didn't have to." Her voice came soft, almost unwilling. "Maybe I wanted to." The words surprised her as much as him. She turned quickly back toward the cabin, heart pounding, unsettled by the flicker of warmth that had breached the walls she had built around herself. By mid-afternoon, Jedediah woke with more color in his face. He shuffled outside, leaning on a cane Elias had carved hastily from a branch. The old man sank onto the porch with a groan, gazing out across the grassland with eyes softened by memory. "This land," he said, voice hushed, "it'll take the breath from you with its beauty, even as it steals the strength from your bones." Clara sat beside him, her sewing in hand, the needle flashing in the sun. "It's not kind," she admitted, "but it's all I've got." Jedediah studied her, the lines of his face deepening. "Maybe kindness comes in the folks who find you when the land's done its worst." She stilled at that, the needle poised above the cloth. The words reached deeper than she wanted to admit. Elias returned from the barn, dust on his skin, shirt damp from labor. He cast a glance at his father, then at Clara, and for a moment the three of them sat in an unlikely tableau: an old man, a young rancher, and a woman who had thought herself beyond company. The sun dipped low, stretching shadows across the prairie. Clara rose to fetch supper, but paused at the doorway, her eyes lingering on Elias where he stood scanning the horizon. His silhouette cut sharp against the burnished sky, a figure both burdened and unyielding. She realized then how much space he filled, not just in her cabin, but in the fragile rhythm of her days. That night, after the meal and chores, Clara sat by the fire with her mending. Elias cleaned his rifle, the methodical click of metal steady in the background. Jedediah dozed lightly, his breath easier now. Outside, crickets sang, and the air carried the sweet, dying warmth of summer. Clara's eyes flicked to Elias. He looked up, catching her gaze, and for a breath neither looked away. Something unspoken passed between them, something that unsettled as much as it steadied. She dropped her eyes back to her work, but her hands shook enough to make the stitches uneven. When she finally rose to retire, Elias's voice stopped her at the doorway. "You saved us yesterday. Don't think I'll forget it." She turned slightly, the firelight warming her cheek. "Don't make it mean more than it did." He nodded once, slow, but his eyes said otherwise. Clara lay awake long into the night, listening to the whisper of wind against the walls, the soft rhythm of two other lives under her roof. Her solitude had cracked, and through it seeped a dangerous, undeniable warmth. Just before sleep claimed her, a sound carried through the night. Horses, faint and far, their hooves drumming against earth. She sat upright, pulse quickening. From the other room, she heard Elias shift, the scrape of wood as he reached for his rifle. The riders had not vanished. They were out there, circling closer. And soon, the fragile shelter of her cabin would be tested again. The prairie seemed to hold its breath the next morning. A thin veil of mist clung to the ground, blurring the horizon where the grass met the sky. Clara stood at her porch with a shawl tight across her shoulders, watching the dew sparkle faintly in the rising light. She had always cherished the quiet of dawn, the way the world seemed to begin again each day, but now the silence felt strained, heavy with the memory of hooves thundering in the night. Somewhere out there, men were circling, and her life, once hidden in solitude, had been dragged into the open. Behind her, the sound of Elias splitting wood broke the stillness. Each strike of the axe rang sharp, sure, echoing through the air like a promise. His father sat nearby in a chair Clara had brought out, bundled in a blanket, the sun warming the hollows of his weathered face. Jedediah's eyes followed his son with quiet pride, though every so often a cough seized him, bending his thin frame until it passed. Clara turned back to the land, her rifle leaning against the porch rail. She had spent years keeping watch over these acres, always half expecting shadows to rise from the grass. Fear had been her closest companion since her husband's death, a fear she had hardened into silence and self-reliance. But fear never left, it only lay quiet, waiting. She thought of Thomas Whitfield, the man she had once followed west with dreams of staking a life. He had been broad in the shoulders, proud of his strength, but blind to danger. He had quarreled with Calder Boone, the land baron who claimed swathes of prairie through intimidation and blood. Thomas had stood his ground, too stubborn to yield, and Boone's men had left him broken on the dirt road one autumn dusk. Clara remembered kneeling there, the dust sticky with blood, her hands pressed futilely against the wound that drained the life from him. After that night, no one had dared challenge Boone. And she had vanished into her cabin, walls her only shield, silence her only ally. Now Boone's name rode again, whispered by neighbors, carried in the frightened voices of travelers. The men who had chased Elias and Jedediah were his, she knew it. The moment she pulled that trigger on her porch, she had tied her fate once more to his cruelty. Jedediah's voice broke through her thoughts. "You've been alone too long, Miss Whitfield. A body ain't meant to stand watch forever." She turned, startled that he had read her so easily. "I manage." His smile was gentle, tired. "Surviving ain't the same as living." He coughed, clutching the blanket tighter. "My boy knows the difference. He's carried me across half this country, trying to find ground where we can plant again. But he hasn't lived proper since his mother passed." Clara's eyes flicked to Elias. His back was to them, the muscles of his shoulders taut with each swing of the axe, sweat darkening his shirt. She saw the discipline in his movements, the restraint that held him upright, and wondered what grief had carved that stillness into him. Later that day, a rider approached, a neighbor from 5 miles off, lean and weary, dust on his coat. His name was Silas Kittredge, a man of few words who usually kept to his own boundaries. Clara met him at the edge of the yard, rifle in hand. "Clara," he said, tipping his hat with nervous eyes. "Word's gone round. Boone's stirring his men. Says there's strangers hiding out in these parts. Looking hard for a wagon, old man with a boy. Sound familiar?" His gaze darted to the cabin. Clara tightened her grip on the rifle. "They're no threat to you, Silas." He sighed, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting pursuit. "No, but Boone'll burn through every farm to make his point. You best be ready. He don't forget, and he sure don't forgive." With that, Silas rode off, his horse kicking up a thin ribbon of dust. Clara watched him vanish, her stomach knotted. Boone's reach had not lessened with years. If anything, his hunger for land had deepened. And now her cabin stood marked again. That evening, she found Elias mending the wagon wheel near the barn. His hands were stained with pitch, his jaw set firm. The low sun burned red across the fields, and the cicadas sang loud in the heat. Clara approached slowly, the words she carried heavy on her tongue. "Boone will come," she said quietly. Elias glanced up, his eyes steady. "Then we'll be ready." "You don't know him," she replied, voice sharp with the edge of old fear. "He takes what he wants, and no one stands in his way. My husband tried." Her throat closed around the memory, but she forced the words out. "He died for it." Elias set down the wheel iron, rising to his full height. The shadow of him stretched long in the sunset. "I don't aim to take your husband's place, Miss Whitfield. But I won't let Boone's men through your door. Not while we're here." The certainty in his tone unsettled her more than his silence ever had. She turned away, clutching her shawl. She had built her life on walls and distance, but these men, father and son, had brought Boone's fury back to her doorstep, and with it, the dangerous flicker of hope she thought long buried. The next days passed in a rhythm that was both foreign and familiar. Elias worked from dawn to dusk, repairing fences, hauling water, strengthening the cabin's shutters. Clara found herself drawn into his efforts despite herself, passing nails, holding boards steady, sharing the quiet labor. Their words were few, but in every glance, in every brush of hands, something wordless grew between them. Jedediah, though weakened, offered advice from the porch, his voice carrying the wisdom of age. One afternoon, as Clara gathered herbs from the garden, Jedediah spoke from where he sat beneath the eaves. "You remind me of my Ruth," he said, his tone low, eyes distant. Strong, sharp, always carrying more weight than she should have had to. Elias takes after her. Quiet, steady. But he's lonesome, same as you. Clara's hands stilled on the sprigs of thyme. She wanted to deny it, to claim her solitude was her choice, her strength. But the truth pressed too heavy against her chest. She had been alone not because she wanted to be, but because fear had locked her heart behind walls. That night, as dusk bled across the horizon, Elias took his watch on the porch. Clara lingered just inside the doorway, candlelight soft on her face. "Why keep moving?" she asked quietly. He didn't turn, his gaze fixed on the darkening prairie. "Because nowhere feels safe. Every time I settle, something rises to tear it apart. I reckon safety's just an illusion men chase." Clara's voice faltered. "Then why stop here?" His eyes met hers, steady, unwavering. "Because for the first time, it feels worth the fight." Her breath caught, and she withdrew quickly into the cabin, heart hammering. She had not asked for his presence, nor the way his words unsettled the ashes she had long buried. The following morning brought proof of their fears. From the ridge to the east, riders appeared, dark shapes against the light. They didn't approach, not yet, but they lingered, watching. Smoke from a signal fire curled upward, a warning, a promise. Clara stood on the porch beside Elias, her rifle clutched tight, and felt the old terror crawl up her spine. "They're marking us," Elias said, his jaw tight. "Testing how long it'll take before we break." Clara's voice trembled despite herself. "Boone won't stop until we're gone." Elias placed a hand on the rail, fingers brushing close to hers, not touching but near enough to ground her. "Then we don't run." She turned to him, eyes searching, torn between dread and the fragile, aching pull of trust. The prairie stretched wide before them, the riders circling like wolves at the edge of the firelight. Clara knew the life she had built in silence was gone. What came next would demand more than survival. It would demand the courage to stand, to fight, to trust again. As twilight deepened, the first shot cracked in the distance, harmless but deliberate. The echo rolled across the grass, carrying with it the promise of war. Clara flinched, her grip tightening on the rifle. Elias did not move, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Jedediah's voice called from inside, ragged but firm. "They're coming, son. And they'll test more than your aim." The air stilled, the land holding its breath once more. Clara felt the weight of it settle on her chest, heavy as the years she had carried alone. But this time, she was not alone. And that truth terrified her more than the sound of distant guns. Dawn broke heavy with heat, a copper haze spilling across the prairie. The cabin stood small against the vastness, its boards dark with dew, its windows shuttered tight. Clara woke to the low rumble of hooves, steady and unhurried, like a drumbeat announcing inevitability. She rose from her bed with her rifle already in hand, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might rattle the walls. Outside, Elias was already on the porch, his frame tall and rigid, his eyes narrowed toward the horizon. Jedediah sat in his chair, wrapped in a quilt though sweat beaded along his brow, his breath shallow but steady. Clara joined them without a word, and together they watched as Calder Boone's men rode into sight. They came slowly, not charging but circling, their silhouettes sharp against the brightening sky. Dust plumed behind them, trailing like a veil of menace. At their center rode Boone himself, broad in the saddle, his dark coat flapping loose, his hat pulled low. His grin was visible even from a distance, the grin of a man who believed the land already his. The riders reined in 100 yards away. Boone's voice carried across the still air. "Whitfield cabin. Never thought I'd see it still standing. Thought the wind would have blown it down by now, or grief." His laugh was harsh, grating. "And what's this? Guests?" Elias said nothing. He stood tall, rifle loose in his hands, his silence an answer sharper than words. Clara felt the tremor in her grip, but she lifted her rifle too, steadying her breath until her aim leveled. Boone shifted in the saddle, his gaze sliding to her. "You could have come to terms years ago, widow. Land like this needs a man to keep it. Instead, you chose to rot here alone. But I'll give you one last chance. Step aside, and maybe I let you keep breathing." Clara's voice surprised even herself, low but iron strong. "This is my land. You'll take nothing from me." Boone's grin faltered into a sneer. He raised a hand, and his riders spread out, forming a crescent. The tension snapped like a whip. A shot cracked, shattering the still morning. Wood splintered from the porch post inches from Elias's shoulder. Elias dropped to one knee, returning fire. Clara followed, her rifle bucking against her shoulder. The air filled with thunder, bullets whining, horses shrieking, men shouting. Jedediah, despite his frailty, dragged himself inside, propping his old pistol on the windowsill, his hand shaking but determined. The riders surged closer, circling, firing into the cabin. Glass shattered, boards splintered. Smoke from gunpowder stung Clara's eyes, and her ears rang with the endless percussion. She reloaded with trembling fingers, her breaths ragged, but each shot she loosed carried the fury of years buried in silence. Elias fought like a wall of stone. His frame absorbed the recoil, his movement swift, unyielding. He felled one rider with a clean strike, another with a shot that sent the man's horse bucking wild. The air was chaos, thick with dust and cries, but in the center of it he stood immovable. Boone rode closer, his revolver flashing. He fired toward the porch, splintering wood near Clara's head. She ducked, heart seizing, then rose with fire in her veins. Her bullet tore Boone's hat from his head, grazing his scalp. He bellowed in rage, spurring his horse forward. The storm broke then, clouds gathering, wind tearing across the prairie. Lightning cracked, thunder rolled, and rain began to pelt the earth. The sudden downpour turned dust to mud, slicking the air with the smell of wet grass and smoke. In the chaos, one of Boone's men set torch to the barn. Flames leapt greedily, orange against the gray rain, smoke curling thick and black. Clara's chest seized. The mule brayed inside, panic sharp and wild. She bolted from the porch before thought could stop her. "Clara!" Elias shouted, but she was already running, skirts heavy with rain, hair plastered to her face. The barn roared with fire, beams groaning. She forced the door open, choking on smoke, tugging at the mule's halter until the beast stumbled out, terrified but alive. Then the roof groaned, a beam crashing down, sparks exploding. She stumbled, the heat licking at her arms, her lungs screaming for air. Suddenly Elias was there, his arm wrapping around her waist, dragging her free. They fell into the mud together, coughing, flames devouring the barn behind them. For a moment, her body pressed against his, rain streaming down his face, his grip iron around her. Their eyes locked, and something fierce and unspoken passed between them. Gratitude, fear, something deeper neither could name. Boone saw them rise, his fury red and raw. He charged on horseback, revolver aimed square at Elias. Time slowed, the thunder above, the rain slashing, Boone's eyes burning with triumph. Then a shot cracked from the porch. Jedediah, trembling, pale, stood braced against the doorframe, his pistol smoking. Boone jerked, eyes wide, blood blooming across his chest. He slid from the saddle into the mud, his revolver falling from lifeless fingers. The riders faltered. Leaderless, rattled by rain and death, they broke apart, scattering across the prairie. Hooves pounded away into the distance, their shouts swallowed by the storm. Silence fell except for the hiss of rain and the low groan of the barn collapsing into embers. Clara leaned against Elias, her chest heaving, her arms shaking. Jedediah sagged on the porch, pistol slipping from his hand, his body drained but his eyes shining with grim satisfaction. Elias lowered Clara gently, steadying her until she could stand. They turned toward the cabin, toward the old man who had held the line when all seemed lost. Clara's heart thundered with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years, not just fear, but something rawer, brighter. The rain eased, leaving the world smelling of ash and wet earth. The sky broke open, streaks of pale gold spilling through the storm clouds. Clara stood on her porch, soaked, her hair clinging to her face, Elias beside her, Jedediah in his chair. The cabin still stood, scarred but unbroken, smoke curling from its wounds. Clara's hands trembled as she set her rifle aside. She looked at Elias, at the strength carved into him, at the steadiness in his eyes. Her voice came low, almost a prayer. No one lives alone forever. Elias held her gaze, and in the quiet between them, something rooted itself, fragile, undeniable, alive. The prairie stretched wide and wounded, but for the first time in years, Clara felt the weight of her solitude lift. What waited beyond this moment, she did not know, but she knew she would not face it alone. The last ember of the barn hissed into steam, and the prairie exhaled. Yet far on the horizon, a black rider lingered, watching, before vanishing into the haze.